Well, hi, Lee. How are you doing today?
Hi, Namali. I'm doing fine. How are you?
Good, hanging in here. Had a good weekend. It's good to be here. Today it's just you and I. We have had a couple of calls prior to this where we went over Ken Wilber's the most basic elements of Ken Wilber's integral theory. And today we thought we will talk about something that we consider, or most integral teachers would consider, is a very important topic when we discuss theory, is to also talk about practice. Um, and specifically, we'll have this call today on shadow. And so we'll talk a little bit about what the definition of shadow is. There could be multiple definitions even, but we'll come back to that. But prior to that, in integral theory, it's really important, coming from Ken Wilber as well as other teachers, that we are practicing these theories in our day-to-day lives, that we're applying those theories in our lives. And at a minimum, Ken Wilber has mentioned that there are four core modules, four core areas where we really should be making an effort to practice. And they are the body module, so the taking care of our bodies, our physiological body, but also in some ways in our states of awareness call, we also talked about our subtle body, our energy bodies, so also kind of our emotional bodies, taking care of those bodies also. So the body module includes all of that. And then there is a mind module, and the mind module means really inhabiting our mental, our intellectual space. I think in some ways in the postmodern era, with in the humanities, it's a really good thing, but it's also sometimes it goes a little too far. Where, for example, at Naropa University, where I did my undergrad, often I would hear, "You're too much in your head. You need to get into your heart and really speak from your heart and speak from your feelings." And occasionally that can go too far, where you are really sort of giving hyper attention to feelings and disregarding the value the value of our intellect and our rational mind. So so I think integral theory or integral practice reminds us to pay attention to our mind, to be in the right mind and a developed and evolving mind. And another module is the spirit module. So our spirituality, attending to our spiritual development as one of the key areas to practice in. And then finally, of the four key areas of practice is called the shadow module. And shadow is important for so many big reasons. And so we thought we'll start our ILP sessions by speaking about shadow. So Lee, what might you like to add? Perhaps it'll be good to hear some definitions from you. I know you teach, I'm sure you teach a lot of this in your integral flourishing class as well. So yeah, tell me.
Yeah, so thanks, Namali. A great introduction indeed. Good to have a sort of a high-level overview of the modules that we can focus our attention on within integral life practice, so the practical application of integral theory. So regarding shadow, yes, absolutely. This is also a part of the integral flourishing courses that I teach. And you're right, it's good to sort of define terms before we move more deeply into a discussion of shadow. And very simply put, we can think of our shadow as consisting of the areas of our consciousness of which we as individuals would unconsciously rather remain unconscious. And that's because these areas of our consciousness are disturbing to us. Now, I said put simply, but it's actually quite complex. So think of basically parts of our awareness that we would like to avoid because they confront us with something difficult. And we can divide this shadow into two parts. So one part is the golden shadow, and the other part is the dark shadow. And we can think of golden shadow as that part of our shadow which contains all aspects of humanity which we idolize in others, but which we insufficiently recognize in ourselves. So if we sort of look up to someone to a large degree, then if we idolize them, so sort of elevate them above ourselves in a deep way, then we're basically projecting some of our inner potential onto that person. So the reason that golden shadow can be disturbing to us is because what we're basically doing when we project our potential outward is we're sort of seeing in the world parts of ourselves that we haven't yet manifested. And if we were to manifest them, then that would take an extreme amount of work, typically. So it can be disturbing to see, oh, that's actually my potential that I recognize in other people, but that I haven't yet actualized in myself. So an example of this golden shadow for me personally would be when I was about, I think, 16 or 17, I listened to the Led Zeppelin, a British rock group, and the singer, Robert Plant, he also plays harmonica. And I listened to him playing harmonica and I thought, wow, that is so amazing. And he's also an amazing singer, or was. And I idolized him as a musician and sort of thought, well, that's unattainable for me. I can never sort of play a harmonica or perform or sing like that. And because I was projecting that outward, I was sort of distancing myself from my own inner potential. So what then started to happen very gradually was that I went to the library at that, because this was a long time ago. So I went to the library and I borrowed some music cassettes of harmonica players and sort of an instruction on how to play the harmonica. And I bought a harmonica and I started playing. And what I gradually learnt was that I could sort of inhabit that. I could inhabit the position of a harmonica player, and what drew me to that was Robert Plant and me sort of idolizing him. And what happened was that the more I started sort of practicing and playing the harmonica, the more I moved in his direction at the level of competency. So I became more competent, and at a certain point I could play reasonably well, or very near the level that he could play when I listened to him. So that was for me a personal example of how we can project our own potential onto the world, idolize someone and think of ourselves as inferior and them as superior. And then the more we sort of move towards that potential that we see in the other person, the more we sort of reclaim the shadow that we projected outward onto them. So that's an example from my personal life of golden shadow. And then there's the dark shadow. We can think of dark shadow as the part of our shadow which contains all aspects of humanity which we condemn in others, but which we insufficiently recognize in ourselves. So dark shadow is disturbing to us because it's very difficult to sort of accept that we're capable of very destructive behavior, and that everything that we see people have done throughout history, that each of us is capable of those acts. So for instance, each of us, given particular circumstances in Nazi Germany, could have been a concentration camp guard if that was our life at that time and we were under certain pressures and we had a particular type of personality. So one way of thinking about dark shadow is that it contains all of the things that we typically tend to think of as evil and outside of ourselves, and that we could never do those things. But an honest reflection on our own potential as human beings sort of leads to the conclusion that we are indeed capable of everything, so to speak, both in the inspiring sense, but also in the destructive sense. So that sort of denying of our own destructive potential, that is a part of dark shadow. And an example of dark shadow for me personally is I typically respond very poorly when people exhibit controlling behavior towards me. So if I have the feeling that people are trying to manipulate me or control me, then I become very belligerent, so very bullheaded and reactive. So that's a sort of a sign that reactivity, so let's say an exaggerated emotionality in response to a sort of harmless stimulus. So for me, that's a sort of a trigger. And interestingly, in that is a sort of a conviction subconsciously that I don't exhibit such controlling behavior, because I respond so reactively to it. So there's a sort of a sense that that I'm innocent of displaying that behavior, but that's entirely not the case, of course. So if I reflect on when I've exhibited controlling behavior, for instance, then once an ex-girlfriend of mine, she was trying to open a jar, and she complained that the lid was too tight, and before I even sort of reflected on it, I'd snatched the jar out of her hands and I'd loosened the lid. And then, very rightly so, of course, she basically confronted me with the controlling nature of my behavior in that moment. And even if as I recall this, it brings some embarrassment to me, of course. So that's an example of where we sort of are triggered by certain behaviors, but that we actually also personally display those behaviors in our daily lives. So as we sort of explore this shadow phenomenon further, it's interesting to recall a quotation from Carl Jung, who was one of the psychiatrists who researched and popularized this phenomenon of the shadow, who said that the most terrifying thing is to accept ourselves completely. So all of our potential, both positive potential that we project outwards as golden shadow, and destructive potential that we project outwards as dark shadow, as we could say. So that's sort of an overview of the terminology with a number of practical examples from my own life. So I'll stop there, Namali, and see whether you have any reflections or additions.
Yeah, no, that was really awesome just to hear, especially your examples as well. And I can resonate in so many different ways, and we can get into like what those triggers can mean to us, I think, in our lives, and how it's paying attention to what kind of triggers us is one of the key ways that we can start what I refer to as shadow spotting. So yeah, I mean, even the word projection, which is a really key part of shadow, its Latin root is the word jectus. So pro is kind of in front, and jectus is to kind of hurl or throw. So to hurl in front of you, to hurl or throw in front of us is the subconscious or unconscious mechanism. And it's a defense mechanism by which our own traits and our own emotions are somehow attributed to someone else or something else. And I know of it in my awareness only through certain triggers, but I don't actually see it in me. I don't actually claim it as mine. So it's like all the feelings, the impulses, the qualities that become repressed, dissociated, disidentified, disowned. And it's not necessarily that we should ever necessarily blame ourselves as having done this, because it's a psychological mechanism that somehow it is a coping mechanism. Often it goes back to our childhood. I remember, just like little things for little kids. If you were trying to take two or three cookies before dinner and your mom gives a little, hey, no, don't do that, you have to wait until after dinner, it can create a little bit of fear and shame in a child's mind. It's like, ooh, I was punished, or I was shamed. And in the little mind, you don't have the cognitive capability or capacity to make sense of what just happened. You just feel it, and you internalize it. I did something wrong. And then perhaps as we grow, that thing follows us, but we don't really know how it really happened to begin with. Um, but I think it was maybe Robert Bly who said, you keep kind of putting them into this invisible bag, all these things that make us uncomfortable. And then we just, as we get older, we just kind of, that bag just gets heavier and heavier, and you're just kind of dragging it around. And then someday, shadow can really sort of backfire. It can explode. And we begin to, if we are paying attention, that's when we need to do the work. That's when some of us, if we're lucky, I think, we begin to see that something about my awareness about what triggers me, I need to pay attention to that. So yeah, the shadow, it represents the personal unconscious or the psychological material that we repress, deny, dissociate. I'm just reading from some of my old notes. It's also, I think, right from the get-go, I also want to say that while integral theory really promotes shadow work, that it's something that we should be doing, sometimes for some people it could really mean very severe trauma and working with trauma. And at that point, it's really important to speak with a psychotherapist. And there's many forms of therapy that people can look for. Gestalt therapy is really good at attending to shadow. Psychoanalytic therapy. But I think even on, if somebody isn't aware of very severe shadow in our lives, kind of split off parts of ourselves, there's plenty of more lighter work that we can do on our own as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. I can also give two of my own examples from my own life. Um, I'll start with like the dark shadow. In a way, it was, I think, several years ago, I could not stand Sarah Palin. She is an American politician from Alaska, and she became the running mate, the vice presidential nominee for John McCain, who was running against Barack Obama. And one day, I mean, I just hated her. She triggered me so much. And then this was around the time that, I think I was very involved in the integral community at that time, and shadow was, of course, something that we often talked about and tried to do and practice. And so I one day sat down to do my shadow practice around Sarah Palin. Why is she such a trigger to me? So I did a lot of work around that, and I was sincere about it. And I think what I found out was that she had a certain level of power. I didn't agree with anything she said, but she held a certain level of power, and she had people's attention, and she wasn't afraid to say whatever was on her mind, at least seemingly so. It seemed like she would just say anything. And something in me wanted that for myself. I mean, I think a lot of us probably have some desire to be seen, to have the attention of our friends or our communities, and to feel like we're powerful in some ways. And I think that there was some, even though I didn't want to be saying anything in the of the content of what she was saying, I wanted to be able to use my voice or to speak out and say certain things. Instead of, what I tended to do was to hold back. And in some ways, I still do that. I think most of us have shadow that lingers, and it's continued work for sure. But I didn't like to think of myself as someone who wanted power. Um, it never kind of occurred to me, because I attached that to as being kind of this super high ego, egotistical kind of personality. But turns out, I think what I found from doing that shadow work around Sarah Palin was sort of like ending up with this idea that, yeah, I kind of secretly want to be as powerful as she is in some strange, odd way, in my own way. So that was sort of the working with the Docker aspect. Positive shadow. Even now to this day, I often notice how I love watching interior decoration shows on TV, like interior design shows. And I'm still working with it because I love Nate Berkus. He's just like one of my favorite interior designers. And his husband, Jeremiah, they're just both really fun, awesome, like super cute people. They're both like really good looking, um, and they just work really well together. Really sassy with each other, and they also get their work done, and they create amazing beauty. I have a secret desire for sure to be an interior designer, interior decorator. I love making spaces beautiful. And I think there is some sort of sadness that I haven't been able to do that somehow. It's a hard line of work to get into. I'm probably too afraid somehow to kind of try that out in a more kind of full way, even though I've always done it in small ways. But I'm definitely projecting onto Nate and Jeremiah some of my own skills and some of my own competencies around creating beauty, um, and really kind of adoring them and loving what they create, and not necessarily giving myself the opportunity to work with that. Um, like you said, it's the unseen, or I think you might have said unowned potential.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And thanks for sharing, Namali. And I think you also touch on a very important point. And so if people who are not yet familiar with the concept of shadow, or who haven't yet worked with shadow material, I think it's very important to also note that because we have a limited lifespan as human beings, and because we have much more potential than we could ever manifest within the limited frame of time that we have on this earth as individuals, there's always going to be unmanifested and unactualized potential, and there's always going to be more darkness that we could potentially embody throughout time. So we can never fully integrate the entirety of our shadow just because it's
Immense.
But it's immense. And also a second reason is that each of us has a particular orientation in the world, which means that we see some things very clearly and other things not so clearly. So I tend to think of it myself just as our physical vision is we can see about, let's say, I don't know how much it is, perhaps 140 degrees angle, but there's so much that we can't see just physically behind us, and there's nothing that we can do that we can see everything with our physical body at once. So there'll always be parts of our physical world, and also, in this analogy, parts of our psychology and parts of life that we cannot clearly see from our own perspective.
Yes, yeah.
The point you raised at the beginning, where some people within some communities say, you're speaking too much from your head, you should speak more from your heart. That's also, from my perspective, or it can be, an interesting expression of shadow, where you basically shut someone down because you either they're saying something that you don't agree with, or you dislike the way they're framing it, and you basically say the way you're communicating is insufficient or is not appropriate. And that's another thing about the shadow, that no matter how well developed we are, we can always subconsciously weaponize all of our sort of development. So we can become very subtle at sort of manipulating others, or trying to keep ourselves from being completely honest about ourselves and things like that.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing to some degree to kind of polarities that appear in our lives, and we have an attraction or a repulsion often to one of the polarities in some ways. So sort of the feeling oriented group versus the intellect oriented group, perhaps. And I think we'll talk a little bit about schools of thought and practices that deal with shadow, or really can help us look into shadow. So polarity management is one of them, I think. I think when we are in shadow, or when it is an disowned shadow, we tend to often see the other side as that, that it's not me. It's not me. It's somehow, if you are showing up as too emotional, then someone who is a little bit more headier can really be triggered by that, because that part of me that is perhaps more heady and intellectual, maybe I have perhaps disowned some of my feelings, or I might have certain shame, or negative relation to some feelings, some experiences that are more coming from the emotional realm. And so when I see that being exhibited in someone else, it can make me uncomfortable. And so I might actually end up being the one who says, you're just so emotional. You're like too dramatic and too emotional. You're such a drama queen or something. But it's in that moment, it's easier for this kind of the more intellectual side of me that doesn't want to really see the emotional side in me. Because perhaps a lot of boys actually growing up often, unfortunately, have been told, don't cry like a girl, or be a man, and things like that. And they really can really sting and create a certain mock. So sometimes in sort of masculine feminine dynamics, sometimes we don't like the other. So again, polarities that we see outside of us, I don't want to really own it as mine, at least a part of it, even just for exploration. It's like, why am I triggered by that? So I think this could be where we can talk about what is shadow in us, and how do we detect that? How do we spot shadow? So there are so many ways we can intuitively kind of start noticing this, if we are paying attention. But one of the key giveaways is if we are feeling really triggered by something. Like there is that charge. I like the word charge also. I feel a certain energetic charge by what somebody is saying. Happens all the time when I'm watching the news. Just having a conversation. Sometimes other people or other events that I might see don't even need to be addressing me. They don't even need to be talking to me. I don't need to be having a conversation with anybody in order to notice this. I can just sort of start feeling it just by watching two other people having a conversation sometimes. So whenever you feel those, you oftentimes it's really good to feel into our bodies, because we feel it often in our bodies. If we kind of start paying attention, like, oh, I'm starting to have sweaty palms, or oh, I'm like, I can feel my like blood starting to boil, kind of thing, you know. I've often noticed sometimes when I'm triggered, I'll start typing really fast. Like if I'm typing an angry email or something, I've now learned to slow down or stop typing sometimes, because I'm like, I'm like really typing super fast, and it's because I'm triggered by something often. So we can often see these triggers manifesting in us in many different ways. Often it's also a repulsion, like we are repulsed by something, or in the golden aspect of the shadow, we're like infatuated by something, thoroughly attracted to something or someone. Um, um, I also listen sometimes. I try to listen to what labels I come up with to, like, he's such a control freak. Um, and you know, he's such a, or she's such a, she's so bossy, or like I try to listen to the labels that get thrown around, sometimes coming at me, or the labels that I use to describe other people and their qualities. Shadow can also sometimes come out as humor, kind of, or sarcasm. So what do we laugh at sometimes? Sometimes we laugh at things that are just a little bit uncomfortable. And so laughter is sometimes a safety or a mechanism by which we can kind of dissipate, or just not deal with, like, ooh, I think there was something that was a little bit cringy there. Is that something I want to pay attention to? So not at all to say that humor is a bad thing at all, or even sarcasm, because sometimes I actually even enjoy being sarcastic. But there's always something to look out for sometimes. If we feel that's the trigger that I'm speaking of. We just sometimes feel it in our heart, feel it in our belly. We can kind of feel it in, you know, we feel it wherever in our bodies sometimes. That something about this that is in my awareness right now is slightly uncomfortable. And then what do I want to do with that? So how might you say is a way of kind of, how would you shadow spot?
Well, for me, um, so two main ways that come to mind immediately are, the first is reactivity. So that's, again, an exaggerated emotion in response to a harmless stimulus.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is to sort of figure out that it's a harmless stimulus, and that can be by discussing it with other people, for instance. So you and I, for instance, have had discussions about people, and that I've said that I felt reactive about a particular type of behavior, and that you said, oh, it could be that this person is doing this and this, and that this is their perspective. And then I thought, aha, so that's interesting to me, because that means that your perspective is such that you don't get triggered by that particular behavior. And in this case, to make it concrete, it was opportunistic behavior, and you were able to see that as a sort of a natural result of somebody's personal orientation to life. And that made it interesting for me to see, okay, so I'm bringing something to my interpretation of this person's behavior that is not naturally there. So it's not there for everyone. So then I know, okay, that I'm doing something in this interaction that makes me get riled up. So I'm bringing a certain judgment or a certain opinion, and I'm ascribing actually bad faith to the person in question, because I'm projecting shadow onto them. And even though, I mean, I can see it happening, and I can reduce the degree to which it happens, but just thinking about the person produces indeed some uncomfortableness in myself. And for me, that's a sign that their orientation towards reality is so different from mine that I can't completely inhabit it neutrally with a feeling of neutral appreciation, or that would not be neutral, but with a feeling of appreciation. So I think your description of your Sarah Palin journey, that is really instructive, and that what you do is indeed you see, what am I projecting onto something, and you can indeed do this by sort of communicating with other people to see whether they are seeing the same projection, whether they're getting the same emotional response. And if not, then you can see, okay, how can I reclaim that projection? So in the case of this person, what I'm seeing as opportunistic behavior is, perhaps it is opportunistic, but then also to see that at sometimes I would benefit personally, for instance, by being more opportunistic, or being less principled, being more flexible, and to see the value of the orientation towards life that the person is bringing to his or her existence, and then to sort of learn from that and to integrate that bit by bit into our own life. So that's a long-winded reply, but those would be my two additions to your.
But I think that what you said was a really good reminder. It's another way that I can look at it, is that I think what you were saying is that when something happens and you check in with other people, and if I find that, wait, like perhaps I'm the only one who's really triggered by this, or I'm kind of attributing a lot to that, and others seem to be not so triggered by that, that's a good way of shadow spotting as well. It's like, it could mean that, okay, maybe there's something I can look into here. Nice. So I also like to think of to pay attention to how we describe others. I think I mentioned that it's like the labels that we give to other people, or even without labels, just to sort of hear how, he used to do this and she used to do that, and I really don't like that. And we kind of become a little bit self-righteous around certain things, and that's a good indicator as well of, perhaps a little work to do here, or something to get curious about. Which also brings me to this important point. So in shadow work, oftentimes we're trying to own something that unconsciously we disowned in ourselves. So to make it a much more healthier, balanced life, these things that split off from us, we're trying to actually embrace them and own them, and then eventually release it, so that we're not held prisoner to that or by that. That does not mean that, let's say, John Doe, who is really triggering me, and I tell him so. It's like, you're really triggering me. We work things out, and then I realize that a lot of the trigger is my own work to do. That doesn't necessarily release that other person from actually having certain things that person may want to look at also. And unfortunately, I'm saying this because I hear this even in the sort of the integral world, integral community, Naropa, it's like I recognize sometimes somebody might say, oh, well, it's your shadow, you deal with it. This has nothing to do with me. This is your stuff, so you go deal with that. But I think if I were being really smart and compassionate and observant about these kinds of dynamics, my place rather would be not to say that, oh, you're triggered with me, so it's your work to do, go figure that out. I would be saying, interesting. I'm surprised that you were triggered by me, and I'm curious to hear more. I'm really interested in learning more about what it is in me that triggered you, and I want to find out if there's more work for me to do here. So I think that's really important, that if there is shadow and if there are two or more people involved, it's really good for everyone to be inquiring and becoming curious. And that's why
I agree.
sometimes it's really helpful for us to do these things in a community.
I agree. And I think this harks back to the point that we were discussing, that every developmental tool can be used as a weapon, and that's part of shadow. So
yes,
we can get good at spotting shadow, and then indeed we can sort of keep ourselves from being accountable by using the shadow spotting as a defense mechanism. So that's, again, I think, a reminder to each of us as individuals to continue to be as authentic as we can be, and as honest in our own motives and our own relation to other people, so that we can use our developmental tools and our sort of growth process as something that brings us together and that helps us to be a better version of ourselves, not to remain entrenched in particular ideologies or negative personality traits or things like that.
yeah, exactly. One other thing that I remembered was just that simple, super simple example of whenever we point a finger, there are three fingers pointing back at us. So wherever out there is where we see see something, that's also in me. There I am. Which actually reminded me, I wanted to actually read this little bit. Is it okay if I read a little bit from, this is Integral Spirituality from Ken Wilber. And, we often talk about, Sigmund Freud is such a kind of a person that comes up often, and he spoke about the id, the ego, and the superego teachings that many of some people learn even in high school psychology. But Ken writes in this book a really interesting thing that many of us may not have realized about ego. So not many people know that Freud never, not once, used the term ego or id, I-D, id. When Freud wrote, he used the actual pronouns the I and the it, I-T, T for Tom. The original German is literally the I and the it, das Ich, the I, and das Es, the it. Strachey, who was the most famous translator, who translated from German to English, Strachey decided to use the Latin words ego and id to make Freud sound more scientific. In the Strachey translations, a sentence might be, thus, looking into awareness, I see that the ego has certain id, ID, D for dog, impulses that distress and upset it. Translated that way, it sounds like a bunch of theoretical speculation. But Freud's actual sentence is, looking into my awareness, I find that my I has certain it impulses that distress and upset the I. And then Ken writes, Strachey used the Latin terms ego or id instead of I and it because he thought it made Freud look more scientific, whereas all it really did is completely obscure Freud, the brilliant phenomenologist of the disowned self. Perhaps Freud's best known summary of the goal of psychotherapy is where id was, there ego shall be. But what Freud actually said was, where it was, pointing there, where it was, there I shall become. Isn't that beautiful? Where it was, there I shall become. I must find the alienated parts of myself, the its that are out there, and re-own them into I. It's hard to find a better summary, even to this day, of what psychotherapeutic shadow work is all about.